At the break of dawn on June 22, 1941, a deafening roar shattered the early morning silence along the Soviet frontier. Over 2,000 kilometers of border became the stage for one of history's largest invasions as the German Wehrmacht unleashed a meticulously coordinated artillery barrage, tearing through bunkers, trenches, and forward positions. Soldiers on both sides felt the ground tremble beneath them, smoke rising in the dim light as the first explosions heralded a war of unprecedented scale. German armored columns surged forward, tanks cutting through forests and fields with astonishing speed, their crews confident that the campaign would be over in weeks, if not days. Across the Soviet lines, commanders scrambled to respond. Many units were caught off guard, communication lines were destroyed, and entire divisions were surrounded in the opening hours. Encirclement battles became a common pattern as the Wehrmacht demonstrated operational brilliance, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners while advancing hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory. The speed and coordination of the German attack shocked both officers and soldiers. Reports of panicked retreats and collapsing front lines reached Moscow, creating the illusion that the Soviet Union might crumble before the summer was even over. Yet beneath the apparent triumph lay the seeds of disaster. German planners had assumed that Soviet resistance would collapse rapidly, that the Red Army's morale would crumble, and that logistical networks would be easily overcome. Ideology played as much a role as strategy, as Hitler's belief in the inherent weakness of Slavic peoples shaped operational decisions. Orders often reflected a mix of military ambition and racial prejudice, emphasizing destruction over careful consolidation. While German divisions raced eastward, supply lines stretched perilously thin. Fuel and ammunition, expected to flow seamlessly, began to falter as the distances grew. Commanders, confident in the speed of blitzkrieg, ignored warnings that extended campaigns could cripple their effectiveness. Meanwhile, the Soviets, though initially overwhelmed, were not collapsing. Political officers and commanders worked frantically to reorganize retreating units, establish defensive lines, and implement scorched earth policies, destroying bridges, railways, and supplies to deny the invaders easy access. In towns and villages along the path of the Wehrmacht, soldiers and civilians alike engaged in acts of defiance, sabotaging vehicles and leaving traps for advancing units. The early shock of the invasion had its effect, but resilience, improvisation, and sheer determination ensured that the Red Army was not yet broken. By the end of the first day, German forces had achieved remarkable tactical successes, yet the strategic picture was already shifting. The initial euphoria of rapid victories concealed growing logistical vulnerabilities and the unpredictable tenacity of the Soviet defenders. Each encirclement, while impressive, did little to destroy the larger system of resistance. German troops advancing deeper into hostile territory were increasingly aware that the vastness of the Soviet Union was unlike anything they had encountered in Western Europe. Harsh landscapes, dense forests, and rivers disrupted their advance, and the initial intelligence underestimating Soviet reserves became glaringly apparent. Soldiers marching through towns abandoned by Soviet forces saw evidence of a populace determined to resist. Propaganda posters, destroyed communication centers, and hidden fortifications hinted at a nation prepared for a long struggle. Even within the German high command, some officers began questioning the feasibility of the timeline. Logistics officers noted fuel consumption far exceeding estimates, and the pace of advance threatened to outstrip supply capabilities. Yet orders from above, infused with ideological certainty, demanded continued aggression. The clash of meticulous German planning with the vast, unyielding reality of the Soviet Union marked the stage for a campaign that would stretch far beyond expectations. The dawn of Operation Barbarossa marked not just the opening of a front, but the beginning of a turning point. For every early victory, cracks in the foundation of German assumptions became more apparent. The speed, surprise, and initial brilliance would not be enough to secure a swift conclusion. Even as the German Wehrmacht pushed forward, shadows of the challenges to come loomed over forests, rivers, and snowless fields, hinting that what began as a triumph could soon turn into a test of endurance unlike any in modern military history.
As the German columns pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the illusion of easy victory began to show cracks. The plan for Operation Barbarossa had been built on a foundation of assumptions as rigid as they were flawed. Hitler and his generals believed that the Soviet Union, a state ruled by what they saw as a fragile and ideologically driven system, would collapse under the pressure of rapid military strikes. The German High Command assumed that Red Army officers were incompetent, that political commissars stifled initiative, and that the morale of Soviet soldiers would shatter at the first sign of serious German advances. These assumptions, however, clashed violently with reality. Soviet military capability was far greater than the Germans had anticipated. Despite purges that had decimated the Red Army's officer corps just a few years earlier, remaining commanders adapted quickly, reorganizing retreating units and establishing defensive positions. Soviet industrial capacity, partially relocated east of the Urals, ensured that tanks, artillery, and aircraft continued to flow to the front, sustaining the fight even as enormous losses mounted. What the Germans saw as a brittle system, Soviet planners recognized as resilient, capable of absorbing shock, and prepared to trade territory for time. Ideology played a critical role in shaping German expectations. Hitler's racial theories insisted that Slavic peoples were inherently inferior, incapable of sophisticated planning, and destined to succumb to German efficiency. The Nazi worldview assumed that the Soviet political system was inherently unstable, that once the Red Army suffered enough defeats, society itself would crumble, paving the way for a swift German victory. These beliefs led to strategic miscalculations at every level. Logistical planning assumed brief campaigns, supply stockpiles were insufficient for sustained operations, and operational focus prioritized encirclements and annihilation of Soviet armies rather than systematic occupation of territory. Commanders were told that military success alone would trigger political collapse, a theory that ignored the depth of Soviet organization and social cohesion. Meanwhile, the Soviet leadership, under Stalin, understood the stakes. Orders flowed down to commanders and civilians alike to implement scorched earth policies, destroying infrastructure, supplies, and anything that could aid the invaders. Factories were dismantled and shipped eastward, bridges and rail lines blown up, and entire towns evacuated to deny German forces the advantages of speed and mobility. This deliberate slowing of the Wehrmacht's advance undermined the German timetable, forcing soldiers to confront not just Soviet troops, but the logistical nightmare of a rapidly receding and hostile landscape. The ideological lens through which the Germans viewed the war also influenced their behavior in occupied areas. Harsh treatment of civilians, summary executions, and reliance on local collaborators were intended to demonstrate dominance, but often fueled resistance. In many cases, partisan activity began almost immediately, tying down German units that should have been advancing toward operational objectives. Instead of collapsing under fear and intimidation, local populations frequently used the brutal occupation as motivation to resist, further challenging the German assumptions of easy control. Even within the German High Command, concerns began to emerge. Reports of Soviet resilience, the sheer scale of territory, and the unexpected speed with which the Red Army could regroup were difficult to ignore. Logistics officers warned that supply lines stretched over hundreds of kilometers were vulnerable, that fuel and ammunition consumption exceeded forecasts, and that winter would soon compound these difficulties. Yet ideological conviction overruled caution. Hitler insisted that continued rapid advance, combined with the destruction of Soviet forces in encirclement battles, would suffice to shatter the Soviet state. The military bureaucracy, unwilling or unable to contradict him, continued to push forward despite mounting evidence that their assumptions were dangerously optimistic. The German advance highlighted the tension between tactical brilliance and strategic misjudgment. Panzer divisions performed with stunning efficiency, executing maneuvers that encircled entire armies and captured vast numbers of prisoners. Yet each victory masked an uncomfortable truth. The Soviet Union was vast, resource-rich, and politically organized in ways that could absorb these losses. The deeper the Wehrmacht moved into the interior, the more vulnerable it became to counterattacks, supply shortages, and the extremes of terrain and climate. By the end of this phase, it became clear that the ideological lens had misled even the most experienced German commanders. Their successes in battles did not equate to strategic victory, and every kilometer advanced increased exposure to the realities they had underestimated. The Soviet Union was not collapsing, it was adapting. Every destroyed bridge, sabotaged railway, and mobilized reserve force revealed that the assumptions driving Barbarossa were fundamentally flawed. What had begun as a lightning campaign aimed at decisive victory was beginning to transform into a test of endurance, one that Germany was ill prepared to face. The initial illusion of superiority was giving way to the sobering realization that speed, surprise, and confidence alone could not account for the resilience, resourcefulness, and determination of the Soviet state and its people.
German forces continued their relentless push eastward, the vastness of the Soviet Union becoming more apparent with every kilometer. Armored divisions cut through forests and plains, encircling Red Army units with precision, and infantry advanced to secure the flanks. German commanders celebrated tactical victories, noting the sheer number of prisoners captured and the rapid collapse of forward Soviet positions. On paper, the operation seemed flawless, a validation of the Blitzkrieg doctrine. However, the deeper they moved, the more the stark realities of extended supply lines and the scale of the territory began to challenge their confidence. Fuel and ammunition, once thought abundant, became daily concerns. Trucks struggled over damaged roads, and rail networks had been destroyed or sabotaged during the retreating Soviet Army's scorched earth policies. Each advance required improvisation to keep mechanized units operational, and every delay threatened the timetable set by the High Command. German soldiers, initially confident and motivated by early victories, began to feel the strain of relentless marches under harsh summer conditions, compounded by the constant threat of ambushes and partisan attacks. The Red Army, though battered and retreating, was far from defeated. Soviet commanders implemented flexible defensive strategies, trading space for time while preserving their core fighting strength. Entire cities were evacuated and critical supplies moved eastward, denying the Germans easy access to resources. Even as Soviet divisions were encircled and destroyed, reserves were mobilized to replace them, and counterattacks in key areas forced German units to pause and regroup. The Germans had underestimated both the depth and speed of Soviet recovery. Partisan activity behind German lines further complicated the advance. Villages and forests became centers of resistance where small bands of fighters sabotaged vehicles, destroyed bridges, and launched ambushes. These seemingly minor disruptions created disproportionate logistical headaches, slowing movement and increasing the vulnerability of stretched columns. Morale among German troops fluctuated as they encountered the harsh reality of an occupied population unwilling to simply surrender. The ideological assumptions that local populations would acquiesce to German authority proved dangerously incorrect. The operational brilliance of the Wehrmacht masked deeper strategic vulnerabilities. Commanders focused on encirclement battles, capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops, but failed to consider the overall capacity of the Soviet Union to replace losses. German planners assumed that each victory brought them closer to a decisive end, but each encirclement, while tactically impressive, did not cripple the enemy's ability to fight.
Far from collapsing, the Soviet military adapted its strategies, utilizing interior lines, rail networks, and mobilized reserves to maintain resistance across multiple fronts. As the campaign pressed on, the enormous distances began to tell. Panzer divisions outran their infantry support, and communication lines grew tenuous. Supply convoys struggled to deliver essentials across hundreds of kilometers of hostile terrain. Forests, rivers, and marshlands slowed armored movements, while air support was limited by extended ranges and fuel shortages. What had initially appeared as rapid, unstoppable momentum began to feel precarious. German units were winning battles, but inching closer to strategic overreach with every advance. Soviet resilience was reinforced by industrial production relocated far beyond the reach of immediate German attack. Factories in the Ural Mountains, Siberia, and beyond continued to churn out tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Soviet forces, though initially on the defensive, were slowly preparing for counteroffensives that would eventually halt the German advance. The scale of these preparations and the ability to replace losses astonished German observers, contradicting the ideological assumptions that had underpinned the invasion plan. Meanwhile, logistical and operational coordination became a daily struggle. Fuel shortages, wear on vehicles, and overextended lines created bottlenecks that could not be ignored. German generals, while achieving brilliant tactical results, increasingly worried about the feasibility of sustaining the pace necessary to achieve strategic objectives before winter. Yet the ideology-driven orders from Hitler insisted on continued advance and total annihilation of Soviet forces in the field. Hesitation or caution was not an option, even as the limitations of manpower, equipment, and terrain grew ever more obvious. The human cost on both sides was staggering. Encircled Soviet soldiers faced annihilation or capture, while German troops endured long marches, relentless combat, and the psychological strain of operating in a hostile environment. Civilians caught in the path of the Wehrmacht suffered displacement, starvation, and terror, fueling resistance movements that further complicated German operations. The sheer scale of the conflict, combined with miscalculations about local collaboration and the enemy's resilience, revealed cracks in the German strategy that would widen as the campaign progressed. By the end of this phase, the campaign's initial brilliance had given way to a sobering reality. Operational victories did not equate to strategic success. German forces were advancing rapidly, yet the deeper they penetrated, the more vulnerabilities emerged. Every kilometer gained stretched supply lines further, exposed flanks to partisan activity, and revealed the capacity of the Soviet Union to absorb losses and continue fighting. What had been planned as a short, decisive campaign was slowly turning into a grueling test of endurance, with Germany's assumptions about the enemy, terrain, and logistics beginning to unravel under the pressure of the vast and determined Soviet response.
As the leaves began to turn and the first hints of winter crept across the vast Soviet landscape, the German advance began to encounter the limits of its own planning. The blitzkrieg momentum that had carried panzer divisions hundreds of kilometers eastward now slowed under the weight of overstretched supply lines, damaged infrastructure, and the sheer immensity of the territory. Roads, already limited and poorly maintained, were further disrupted by retreating Soviet forces, leaving convoys of trucks and tanks stranded or forced onto difficult terrain. Fuel shortages became a daily reality, and ammunition resupply struggled to keep pace with the intensity of ongoing operations. German soldiers, confident in early victories, began to feel the strain physically, mentally, and logistically. The Red Army, while still reeling from initial encirclements and losses, was far from defeated. Soviet commanders, learning from early mistakes, began consolidating units and establishing fortified defensive positions outside major cities and along key transportation hubs. The Soviets implemented scorched earth policies with ruthless efficiency, destroying bridges, railways, and supplies to deny the invaders essential resources. Factories in occupied areas were dismantled or sabotaged, and entire populations were evacuated eastward, preserving the industrial capacity necessary for long-term resistance. These actions bought precious time and forced the Germans to confront the reality that the Soviet Union could endure immense losses without collapsing. Harsh weather began to complicate operations further. Rain turned roads into quagmires, slowing mechanized units and immobilizing trucks loaded with fuel and ammunition. Rivers swollen by seasonal rains became formidable obstacles, and forests slowed advances while offering cover for Soviet defenders and partisan fighters. Morale among German troops, already strained by long marches and intense combat, was further tested by the constant uncertainty of supply shortages and the hostility of the occupied population. Ideological assumptions that local civilians would accept German dominance were increasingly proven false as sabotage and resistance grew in frequency and effectiveness. Despite these mounting challenges, the German High Command continued to press forward, convinced that capturing Moscow before the onset of winter would end the campaign decisively. Panzer divisions were pushed to their limits in repeated attempts to break through fortified positions, but the Soviets, utilizing interior lines and rail networks, managed to reinforce threatened sectors quickly. The initial German belief that rapid victories could force political collapse of the Soviet state was proving dangerously optimistic. Every delay and every stalled assault chipped away at the timetable that had been central to Hitler's strategy. The human cost of the campaign became increasingly evident. German soldiers faced exhaustion, frostbite, and the psychological toll of constant engagement, while Soviet troops fought with desperation and determination, often sacrificing themselves to slow the enemy advance. Civilians endured mass displacement, hunger, and terror, but their resistance, whether through partisan activity, sabotage, or aiding retreating Soviet forces, contributed to the slowing of German operations. The war was beginning to shift from a campaign of maneuver and encirclement into a grinding test of endurance. Winter loomed not only as a physical challenge, but also as a strategic one. German supply chains, already vulnerable, would struggle to meet the demands of mechanized units in freezing conditions. Vehicles and weapons were not designed for prolonged operation in sub-zero temperatures, and shortages of winter clothing and medical supplies exacerbated suffering. The assumption that the campaign could conclude before the harsh season arrived had proven dangerously flawed. The Soviets capitalized on every weakness. Counterattacks were launched where German units were overextended or fatigued, creating unexpected casualties and forcing local withdrawals. Engineers and soldiers repaired damaged infrastructure where possible, maintaining lines of communication and supply that the Germans had assumed would fail permanently. In the rear, partisan operations continued to disrupt convoys, destroy stockpiles, and ambush isolated units, demonstrating that no area of the occupied territory was truly secure. By mid-campaign, it was becoming clear that Barbarossa was no longer a lightning campaign. Each tactical success carried the risk of overextension, and the Germans' inability to achieve a decisive breakthrough before winter threatened to turn initial triumphs into long-term vulnerability. German officers began to recognize the limitations of their strategy. Brilliance on the battlefield could not overcome logistical shortages, vast distances, resilient opponents, and an unforgiving climate. Yet orders from Hitler emphasized speed and annihilation, leaving little room for cautious adaptation. The clash of strategic overreach and Soviet resilience defined this phase of the campaign.
The advance slowed not because of any single decisive battle, but because the cumulative effect of geography, logistics, weather, and human determination eroded the feasibility of rapid victory. The illusion of control, fostered by early success, gave way to the harsh reality that Germany's assumptions about the Soviet Union's collapse were deeply flawed. What had started as a war of rapid encirclement and tactical brilliance was transforming into an attritional struggle that neither side had fully anticipated, setting the stage for the brutal confrontations of the following years.
By the time the campaign reached its later stages, Operation Barbarossa had transformed from a plan for swift victory into a grinding ordeal that would define the fate of Nazi Germany. The initial shock of the invasion had given way to a stark reality. The Soviet Union, far from collapsing, had absorbed enormous losses and continued to organize, reinforce, and counterattack. Encirclements that once yielded hundreds of thousands of prisoners now did little to halt the strategic recovery of the Red Army. Each German advance further stretched supply lines, exposed flanks, and deepened the vulnerability of overstretched units. Tactical brilliance alone could no longer compensate for flawed assumptions, logistical bottlenecks, and the sheer scale of the territory. Soviet resilience became increasingly evident as winter approached. Troops who had been forced to retreat in the summer now regrouped, reinforced by industrial output relocated east of the Urals and by fresh recruits drawn from a mobilized population. Factories previously thought out of reach produced tanks, artillery, and aircraft at a pace that challenged German expectations. Soviet commanders used interior lines to concentrate forces at critical points, launching counteroffensives that exploited German overextension. What had been conceived as a war of annihilation along a 2,000-kilometer front was evolving into a war of attrition that Germany was ill-prepared to sustain. German forces suffered as much from their own logistical failures as from Soviet resistance. Fuel, food, and ammunition were chronically scarce, and vehicles broke down in harsh terrain. Soldiers faced frostbite, exhaustion, and the mental strain of endless combat in hostile territory. Commanders faced impossible choices, balancing orders for rapid advance against the realities of overextended lines and vulnerable units. Morale declined as victories failed to produce strategic success, and the human cost of the campaign mounted dramatically. Meanwhile, Soviet partisans intensified operations behind German lines, sabotaging railways, bridges, and supply depots. Civilians previously displaced or terrorized increasingly aided the Red Army, providing intelligence, shelter, and logistical support. These efforts compounded the challenges facing the Wehrmacht, forcing units to divert attention and resources to secure the rear while still attempting to press the offensive. Every step deeper into Soviet territory magnified the risks of overreach, demonstrating that ideology-driven assumptions about passive populations were disastrously wrong. By late 1941 and into 1942, the strategic picture for Germany had worsened. The failure to capture Moscow before winter was a turning point. Soviet counteroffensives, bolstered by reinforcements and winter-hardened troops, halted the German advance and inflicted severe casualties. The blitzkrieg that had seemed unstoppable in Poland and France had faltered under the combined weight of geography, logistics, climate, and resilient opposition. German commanders began to understand that the campaign would not be resolved quickly, yet Hitler's ideological insistence on continued aggression left little room for strategic flexibility. The war of attrition had begun in earnest. Initial German calculations assumed a short campaign. They did not account for the immense industrial capacity, manpower reserves, or organizational resilience of the Soviet state. As months turned into years, German losses mounted, while Soviet production and mobilization accelerated. Each failed offensive and prolonged engagement further drained Germany's ability to sustain the conflict.
Political and military leadership faced increasing strain, yet Hitler's ideological beliefs, assuming racial superiority and the inevitability of Soviet collapse, continued to shape operational decisions, often with disastrous consequences. As the campaign dragged on, the human and material toll became staggering. Millions of soldiers and civilians perished, cities were destroyed, and entire regions were left devastated. German forces, though tactically competent and capable of local victories, were caught in a conflict whose scale they had fundamentally misunderstood. The initial optimism of a rapid victory had given way to a protracted struggle, highlighting the gap between tactical brilliance and strategic failure. Every day, the limitations of German assumptions, underestimating Soviet resilience, overestimating the impact of ideology, and ignoring logistical realities, were painfully evident on the front lines. By the end of Barbarossa, it was clear that Hitler's greatest mistake had not been in tactical execution, but in strategic conception. The campaign, intended to secure Lebensraum, destroy the Red Army, and force the collapse of Soviet political power, had instead set Germany on a path of sustained attritional warfare. Soviet forces, recovering and counterattacking, began to push the Wehrmacht back, signaling the beginning of a long-term reversal that would ultimately culminate in the fall of Berlin. The German High Command, despite battlefield successes, had been undone by flawed assumptions, overreach, and the resilient power of the Soviet state. The red flag eventually rose over the Reichstag ruins, marking the symbolic and literal defeat of Nazi Germany. Hitler's death in the charred remains of the Reich Chancellery underscored the catastrophic consequences of strategic misjudgment. Barbarossa, conceived as a campaign to decisively secure German dominance in the East, became the beginning of a protracted struggle that Germany could not win. The campaign serves as a stark historical lesson. Tactical success cannot substitute for strategic clarity, and assumptions, no matter how confident, must contend with the realities of geography, logistics, human endurance, and the resilience of an opponent prepared to fight at all costs.